Well, hello and welcome to this week's of Photographic Life and the return of the conversation and the return of Bill Shapiro, who is the former editor-in-chief of Life magazine. Life was relaunched in 2004, and that launch was the largest in Time Inc.'s history. Later, he served as the founding editor-in-chief of Life.com, which won the 2011 National Magazine Award for Digital Photography. A fine art photography curator for galleries and a consultant to photographers. Bill is also a contributing editor to the Leica Conversation series and a monthly guest here at the UN of Photography podcast, A Photographic Life. He has written about photography for the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, Esquire, Vogue, The Atlantic, Oprah, the Los Angeles Times, Texas Monthly and Blind Magazine, among others. Say Less, a photography book he edited and for which he wrote the text, won the 2024 Lucy Award for Best Traditional Photo Book. He was recently named by Blind Magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the photography industry. Bill is also the author of several books and has recently launched the Blue Photo Collective at www.bluephoto.co, where you'll find high-quality limited edition prints and a collectible photo book extravaganza from both big-name and photographers and those flying under the radar. On Instagram, he's at Bill Shapiro. Here, he's Bill. So, Bill, welcome back to Photographic Life. Hopefully you've had a good summer.
I have. It only seems like a moment ago that we were talking, Grant.
It does, doesn't it? And obviously nothing has happened at all in the world over the last few months, so not much to discuss.
Nope, an absolute flat line. No politics, no war, nothing like that. No sports or music. So why don't we just talk about photography?
Yeah, why not? Exactly. Now, look, I'm involved in education, I suppose. But this month you wanted to talk about education. You wanted to talk about photographic education.
I did, and I wanted to talk about it for a couple reasons. One is because from time to time you mentioned your role as a teacher, and I thought it'd be interesting to get deeper into that. But also, I speak with sort of in a consulting role with a lot of photographers who are making their way. Not yet professional, or maybe not yet even entirely fully up to speed, and they always ask me, should I take classes? Should I enroll in a formal education? How should I continue my practice? And I have different answers for them, sort of based on what I feel their work is looking like then and what their interests are and sometimes their personality. And I don't know, I might be wrong in doing that. And I thought it would be nice to interrogate my instincts there against the changing photographic landscape, and just to sort of, see what you thought.
Well, what are you talking about with education? Because we can educate ourselves on our own, personal education. We could do workshops, or we could be within a formal institution.
Yes, I am talking about all of those things. I am not a photographer, as I say often on this podcast in our conversations. I take pictures. My pictures have gotten better and better and better over the years, in my eye. And I think that's mostly because I have exposed myself to the works of great photographers. I was lucky enough to be the editor of Life magazine and to meet wonderful photographers, both current photographers and some of the old Life masters. But mostly, I was able to look through the archives and look at the photos that were taken by some of the greats that made it into the magazine, and those that didn't make it into the magazine. And so that's self-education, but I think it only takes you so far.
Well, I think we both had the same self-education, because when I was at Vogue House in London, I spent days and days just going through the archive of all the old GQs and Vogues and what have you from around the world for over the decades. And you're right, it does only take you so far. And I suppose really what I always think about education is don't get involved in it until you've worked out what your expectation is of it.
Um, Tell me what you mean in terms of.
Well, what outcome do you want? And I say this because over the last couple of years, I've founded and have been running an MA in photography. And what's interesting doing that, as well as the undergraduate course that I run, is that I'm talking with and speaking with a lot of photographers in age range, I would say from early 30s through to mid 60s. And I can identify themes. But the first question I always ask them is, well, why are you doing this? What do you want to get from it?
So I think that's really interesting. And when I work with photographers who approach me and say, I want to make a book, I ask the exact same question. Because and then we've talked about that and we can talk about it again, and I'll leave it to the side. At the same time, with respect to education, I'm not sure you should necessarily know what you want before you start playing in the sandbox. Like I went to a liberal arts college. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up. So I took classes in psychology and history and this and that. And I knew I didn't want to do math. And just playing and experimenting took me to a place I didn't necessarily expect.
I think that's good. Nothing is a straight line. However, I'm always very aware of the financial commitment that's being made, the time commitment. And whereas in the UK, when I went to art school, it was free. I didn't have to pay anything to go. It was all paid for by the government. Today, there's quite a considerable financial investment being made. And I think it's useful to have some kind of an idea when you start. If that changes or it evolves or if it turns into something completely different, I think that's okay. But I don't think, and I think this is where there's a big change in education, whether it's learning photography or anything else. People now do see it as an investment in something, not just an investment in play.
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about an investment in what, because it may not be an investment in selling your pictures and making a living from that. But, as usual, I've talked to a few really great people, and they talk about some of the sort of side benefits of studying photography that don't necessarily translate to selling, images to magazines or books or advertisers or anything like that. And maybe that's something we can talk about in a few minutes.
Well, no, I think that would be really good because actually I spoke to my MA students at the end of the summer after their first year with me, and I said to them, "What have you got from the last year?" And what they all said was confidence. We didn't talk about, oh, I now know how to light this, or I now know how to print that. It was much, much bigger. And I think that any form of education, it should be, you should begin it as one person, and then you need to leave it as a different person. There needs to be that personal growth because that's what good education brings you.
But so let me ask you this, going back to what you said a moment ago, that a person should sort of know what they want to get out of the program in a way, or what they think they want to get out of it. So if someone goes in with a very focused idea of what they want to get out of this program because they want to shoot X, Y, and Z, is that a good thing or a bad thing to go in with a very focused view?
I don't think there's good or bad. I mean, I can give you an actual example of that, of a student that joined me about a year or so ago, and they came with the idea of making a book. They'd already made a body of work that they felt was going to be the book, and they wanted help and mentoring through the MA to get to that book. After roughly 4 or 5 months on the course, that book idea had gone out of the window. They were doing completely different work. They redid, they're a working, successful photographer who was getting fed up with doing boring work. We helped them redo their website, create new work, and they're already getting commissioned by the kind of clients they wanted to get commissioned by. So I think the commissioning, the selling of a book, the exhibition, I think they're byproducts of the journey. But I don't think there's anything wrong with coming with them. But an expectation, and I've been interviewing students. I should say, I've got students from the States, I've got them from Norway, from Germany, from Switzerland, from Austria, as well as from the UK. So quite an international mix of students. And they all want the same thing, which is they all want to try and work out what they should do with their work.
So two things come to mind. One is, and I'll just say this briefly, Ralph Gibson, the great American photographer, is fond of talking about a story or a lesson that Dorothea Lange taught him about a point of departure. And she said to Ralph, and he was assisting her, go out with your camera to shoot, but always have a sense of what you want to shoot. Go out with a point of departure. That can change. You don't have to shoot it. But if you go out looking for nothing, you won't find it. If you go out looking for something, you will find something, and maybe something else. And he subscribes to that, and I quite like that too. And it is about the journey. Stepping back for a second, though, I think the other reason why I wanted to talk about this subject is because I am seeing a lot of master classes being advertised, online, 6 or 12 sessions with this maybe well or maybe not well known photographer, and it's not cheap. There's tons of stuff on YouTube, how to be a photographer, and I guess I kind of wanted to put those in context as well. A lot of the camera companies have classes where their ambassadors teach this or that on a short course, which is not an MA, but it might be 6 hours over 3 weeks or something like that. So yeah. I thought that was another reason.
I think that's. I mean, I see that a lot as well, and I'm afraid I am rather cynical about it. I have no problem with it if you can afford it. I suppose, in a sense, if you really want to know how a photographer lights something or does something, that's fine. But there's a sense there of replication and not of creation. And I think there's an element of problem there. But also, if you're going to go and study within an institution, you're looking at 3 years, 1 year, or 2 years, depending upon your commitment to the course, whether it's full-time or part-time, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate, if it's an MA or MFA. And therefore, that time is time to actually evolve and develop as a person and develop the soft skills, transferable skills, which are outside of photography. And I have to say, the MA I teach is also online. Mm-hmm. So we are very focused, and I'm always focused on the why rather than the how, because in my belief, there's no point knowing how if you don't know why, and you can't know how unless you know why. Because right. The how will always change dependent upon the why.
Right.
So, which I think ties in with the Ralph Gibson quote.
Yeah. And, speaking of Ralph Gibson, he teaches short classes, a few sessions, a master class in bookmaking. And one time he dropped me an email and he said, I've met this wonderful student in the class. He's got a body of work that I think really has potential. Would you talk to him? And I did. And ultimately we ended up making a book together, which won a big award. And I guess the other thing that can come from some of these classes is that connection with the photographer, with the master photographer. So there are the skills that you will learn, hopefully, and the intellectual insights you will get. But there might also be, if you're the right person and the right fit, there also might be some sort of networking payoff for you.
I think there might be, but I think through my experience, there aren't that many people who are in the position that the particular photographer that you're mentioning are in. I think they're quite often more confused. I
Uh-huh.
think they may have looked at some YouTube things or heard some other stuff from other people. And when I look at the bodies of work, what I'm seeing invariably is it's a bit like driving. You can drive a car and learn a lot of bad ways of driving. And so I spend more of my time teaching people to unlearn what they've learned and then go back to the beginning and then start with a new thought process. But I'd be interested to hear, Bill, who you spoke to, because I don't want to make this about my experience.
Yeah. Well, I spoke with some really great photographers, and the first one I spoke with is named Amy Vitale, and I was so pleased to speak with Amy and to ask her a few questions. She's a National Geographic photographer, a documentary filmmaker, and a writer. She focuses on the stories of people living on the front lines of war, climate change, and extinction, who refuse to let the cataclysm define their futures. These days, she tells me, she's focused on Vital Impacts, a nonprofit she created that supports photographers working on environmental issues with grants and intensive mentoring. And we'll put a link in the show notes to that, because that's pretty exciting. So I asked her, what are a couple of the most important skills that students tend to learn studying photography? And she told me, photography teaches you how to truly see the world, how to slow down, observe carefully, and find meaning in the smallest details. It's not just about making images, but about cultivating awareness and empathy. Students also learn patience and persistence, because powerful storytelling rarely happens in an instant. They take time, trust, and a deeper understanding of what's unfolding in front of you. And I asked her a few more questions, but I thought this was really nice. And when you and I were talking a minute ago about maybe some of the unexpected benefits of studying photography besides landing a corporate advertising job, and this is a theme that comes up with some of the other people I spoke with as well, which is the idea of changing the way you see, perceive, and take in the world, which is kind of beautiful, I think.
Well, I think that's the key. I mean, as I said before, I don't really want to make this about me, but as I'm talking from my personal experience, the two courses I run, I describe them as learning photography as a visual language. I don't see that any of my teaching in photography is about turning somebody into a photographer or making them a better photographer. Well, yeah, that tends to happen, but it's not intrinsically that. I think in a world that we live in today, which is so dominated by the photographic image in communication, that it's beneficial to everybody to be able to speak that language. And that's the key. And I think it kind of ties into what you were saying at the beginning there, when you're saying that, you feel you're a better photographer because of the work you've looked at and because of the conversations you've had. And I think that good photographic education is actually a conversation. It really isn't much more than that.
I think it has also made me a better person in the world in terms of seeing beauty where I might not have seen it before. When you speak to Buddhists, they also, they see things, they experience things that non-practicing people don't see. And I think there's something to that. My appreciation of beauty in the world, even though I can't capture it because I do not have the skills or the equipment, but just
You need to do an MA, Bill. I'll sign you
I
up.
think I do. But just being able to see something the way a photographer might, frame it the way a photographer might has really provided me a lot of personal joy.
But I think that's seeing rather than looking.
Fair enough.
And I think that's the real challenge for a lot of people who are engaged with photography is that they can get tied up with the idea of creating the photograph
Uh-huh.
and forget about seeing.
Which is okay. Let me read the next question that I asked Amy because I think that works nicely. Are there aspects of photography, I asked her, that can't be taught? Are there limits to what can be learned? And she said, yes. You can teach technique, but you can't teach curiosity, empathy, or courage. Those come from lived experience and from being open to the world. So,
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with her more. But that lived experience, quite often, again, I'm just going to have to do this episode, but from my experience, a lot of people who I speak to who come into photographic education have never really thought about that lived experience as having the true value that it actually has.
tell me what you mean by that.
The Their lives, I talk to them. I've got a guy at the moment who swims with whales in the Pacific Ocean. I've got a professional Red Bull skateboarder. I've got a guy who's a wood turner. I've got a guy who is who's an attorney in the Supreme Court of Philadelphia. All of them are coming from such amazingly diverse backgrounds, but haven't really thought about bringing that into their photography until we start speaking about that thing. It's almost as if I think the reason for learning photography or for studying it in a formal environment outside of the masterclass or the YouTube is that you can have those conversations that make you realize that the life you've led is the photography you can make, rather than photography being this thing at the side that you use to make photographs.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. That's great. And I think there's an aspect of that I want to circle back to when we hear from the last person I spoke with, Alex Harris. Let me finish up with Amy real quick. I asked her, what are the common misconceptions or incorrect expectations that people have when they're thinking about taking a photography class? And she said, many think it's just about mastering a camera. In reality, it's about storytelling, connection, and perspective, the things that go far beyond the gear. And I think we can probably both agree on that.
We can completely agree on that. And it does always surprise me that I do occasionally get emails from people. We get lots of positive, I should say, but I do occasionally get one saying, oh, stop talking about this storytelling. Photography's got nothing to do with storytelling. Obviously, I don't know what to say in response to that because we all know that it is.
Yes. I also spoke with Stephen Vanasco. He is a Los Angeles-based photographer who explores all subject matter with his camera, aerial, street, concerts, portraits, etc. He teaches 2 workshops with the Leica Academy, aerial photography and introduction to pigment dye inkjet printing. And I'm a big fan of his work on Instagram and beyond. So I asked Stephen, assuming that someone is really interested in being a photographer, why study photography and why avoid studying photography? And he said, in my opinion, I think it's helpful to know where an art form has been and what has been done with it. This can help someone figure out where they want to go with it. Also, it feels like a bit of respect for the medium and those who came before and who created some amazing work. The flip side is to avoid studying photography. Sometimes it can be helpful not to fill your mind with so much info, almost like approaching it with a clean slate creatively and seeing what arises can be fascinating in its own right.
Well, where does he teach, by the way? And where does Amy teach?
So Amy is teaching less now because she's focused on her her nonprofit. But she used to teach, and not at a university, I don't think, but workshops. And Stephen teaches through the Leica Academy, which is sort of a short course programs, specialized. Could be street photography, could be, black and white, that kind of thing.
I mean, the reason I ask is because I do teach within a formal university
Mhm.
setting, is that there are very different requirements of the person who's doing the teaching when you're teaching within a formal environment. So, for example, I have to teach within guidelines and modules that are set, and I have to
Right.
stick to that, and I have learning outcomes, and I have all of this kind of structure. Whereas obviously they don't have that. They're far freer to come up with a title for a workshop or a series of workshops.
Well, and also I think it's more personality based. Like you don't necessarily sign up for one of Stephen's workshops if you don't like Stephen's work.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so it's a little self-selecting in that way.
Yeah, it is. But at the same time, I do completely agree about the importance of this understanding of the past. And
Yes.
once again, you and I, we talk on here and we bounce names around, and we're pretty much we know what each other is talking about. But it always is quite surprising to me how many people I talk to who are involved with photography or interested actually have a very limited knowledge
Mm.
of photographers. Which, if you were going to study music, you'd have a huge knowledge. We probably have a bigger knowledge of musicians and music than most people do of photographers.
It's funny you mentioned this because I just posted on Instagram the other day about the new uh, auction coming out from Lights or Lates, I can't remember, who makes Leica, and there's a bunch of photography auctions that come out every year, and I happen to like the Lights auction very much. I love going through their catalog because it is an education for me. There's always photographers who I've never heard of, and there's always images by photographers I have heard of that I've never seen. And I think that's just the way they sort of collect images for these catalogs. But I really would urge people to you don't have to check out the catalogs because it really can take you down a rabbit hole that is beautiful and entertaining and educational.
You're absolutely right. I used to be a creative director at Sotheby's. And so I have many of those catalogs. And I used to go along to the auctions and stand there just to hear and see this stuff. I mean, you
Yes.
can't, there are so many different places you can learn about photography from. It's not just one channel there. But also, I think I mean, we all never know everybody, and every day we can learn, and we love finding new photographers. There's
Yeah,
nothing,
that's the fun. Yeah.
yeah, there's nothing better. But as I say, I think one of the things I often say is that you go to university, so let's say study photography, to learn about things you didn't know existed. And I think that's the reason to study photography, to be honest,
Yeah.
is to find out about things, not just to polish up your skills on this or polish up your skills on that, but literally to be challenged, particularly by things you don't like.
Yeah, I mean, it's the fun of it, the challenge of it is being dropped into the deep end of the pool.
Yeah.
Um, you
And
know,
being shown things you don't like and then being told, well, why don't you like them?
right. Uh,
Let's really discuss that.
so I think that's a great reason to study photography. I also I asked Stephen, what are a couple of the most important skills, practically or intellectually, that students tend to learn studying photography? And he told me some of the skills I try to embed in my workshop attendees is learning how to step outside themselves and outside of their work, to try to look at it with a different set of eyes, spotting context within framing that they may have dismissed, or realizing a different approach to their work to help build a more expansive body of work. Intellectually, I would say just being able to understand their own photos. I try to incorporate a print aspect to my workshops as much as possible. I think people seeing their work printed is so important for them to understanding themselves.
Hmm. Yeah. I'm not so sure that it needs to be printed, but
Well,
I get the idea.
what I think is such a great takeaway from what he said was, and I'm going to just read his quote again. I think people seeing their work printed is so important for understanding themselves. So set the printing part aside.
Hmm.
But one of the, I think, great benefits of studying photography, which is studying how you see the world.
Oh, yeah.
Studying your own pictures and how you see the world should tell you more about yourself.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, my good friend David Eustace always says, I get paid, he's a photographer and film director, I get paid to show people how I see the world. How great is that?
yes.
You know,
And to start to understand how you see the world and what the world means to you is a way of self-reflection that I think is not only beautiful, but also helps you develop your visual voice and your sort of visual signature.
I think it does. But again, I think that when you're going to those kinds of workshops, I think to get the most from them, you need to be pretty evolved, developed as a photographer, whereas a lot of the people I speak to are struggling at finding subject matter. They're right at the very beginning
Right.
of that process, despite perhaps having a lot of photographic experience.
That's something I want to come back to in a minute. I'm going to make a note about that, sort of how to find subject matter, because I think that's really important. Um, I asked Stephen, are there aspects of photography that cannot be taught? Are there limits to what can be learned? And he said, I do think there are aspects of photography that just can't be taught. If you are trying to help bring out someone's eye, you can share techniques, approaches, or ideas, but it comes down to how the person processes it. Some have the ability and creativity to output such ideas, and some people just don't. I think in that regard, it all depends on someone's drive and willingness to push themselves to learn and to create.
Um, yeah. Um, I think you can I've had to get people you'd think really were really struggling, to come up with bodies. But I think you can teach anybody photography. I don't think there's anybody you can't teach photography. I think there are certain levels to which they can reach, you know.
Well, so let's talk about what learning photography means. Can someone learn how to um, follow an advertising brand director's directive and shoot the cheese the way the cheese wants to be shot for this? Yes, I think that is possible. Just like I think it is possible to teach a decent writer how to write a decent enough news story. 5 paragraphs, you start with this, you got 3 sources, you end with this. But that same writer cannot necessarily write a 5,000 word feature story with perspective and nuance that I actually want to read. So I think there are different levels of this.
I agree, but I think that's where it gets to where I was saying there at the beginning about expectation of learning. You
Yes.
know, because if you're really happy to get to the end and think, yeah, I can now write that news story, then it's been a successful
Yep. Fair
process.
enough. Fair enough.
You know, if you want to be James Joyce, it's going to be slightly more difficult.
Slightly. Um, I asked Stephen the final question for him. What's a common misconception that people have about studying photography? These days, he told me, with YouTube University and anyone having the ability to share their hot take, is that studying can be too formal or that you can just do it on solely on your own, which he says, I think is a big misconception. When asked if going to school for photography is worth it, I will say absolutely. I never had the chance to go to a formal school for photography, but I made it an intentional choice. And still, to this day, I ask questions and I listen to people who I meet that have been doing this for a lot longer than I have.
Well, listening is the key.
Yep.
Without a shadow of a doubt, listening to the people who know and who've done it before is the key. And yeah, You know, learning photography, I think it's like Amy was saying there. Yes, you can teach an awful lot and you can learn a lot on YouTube. And I quite often say to people, do you know what? If you really want to learn that, go on YouTube. You can find that on YouTube. But you can't learn empathy on YouTube. You can't learn how to engage with people one to one or how to find a story and then how to develop that story on
That's right.
YouTube. And you can't find the photographers you really need to see on YouTube because you don't know their names.
Right.
So you need someone to say, oh, look at this or read this or look at that, and that's the basis of it, really.
And you also need someone, I think, to say, as I have done with some of the photographers that I work with, yeah, like recently, a guy sent me his portfolio because he wanted to make a book, and all of his pictures, which were nice enough, were all taken from about 10 feet away or seemingly 10 feet away. And I was like, how come you don't get closer? And he was like, I'm scared. And I was like, fair enough. For your next lesson, you're going to go up to people and you're going to get closer. And I'm making you do that. And I'm not really making him, but he needed that small nudge.
Well, that was the confidence I was talking about earlier
Yeah.
that my students say to me that they've now got the confidence. But is there one photographer? I have one photographer who I always say to all students who come to me, look at that photographer's work. Is there one that or are there a couple that you often point people towards?
Um, I mean, this is I'm caught off guard by that question.
Good.
I will always tell people to look at Robert Frank. Um,
So
you
guess
know,
who I was going to say?
how about Robert Frank?
Robert Frank.
There you go.
I always say Robert Frank. And so, I caught you off guard, but why? So why do you point to Robert Frank?
I point to Robert Frank because I feel like he was breaking some rules at the time, and I don't know if he. I suspect he didn't go to photo school, but he had this combination of following his vision. It's very clear how he sees the world from his photographs, and the idea that he chased what he wanted to see. He chased what he was seeing and learned how to express it in many different ways and unexpected ways. And his pictures capture a feeling as much as a subject.
Yeah. And he's loose.
And he's loose.
For me, that's the key is that I think it's a mistake to take up any kind of photographic learning and think that you're going to be told a set of rules which you will then follow, which will guarantee you success. I mean, I always say that 2 plus 2 equals 4 in math, but in photography, 2 plus 2 equals whatever you want it to do.
Right.
Because there are no rules and there shouldn't be any rules. And I think good photographic education teaches you that there aren't any rules. And if there are some rules, but there are a few, then just break them.
Right. I think learn them and then break them.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Um, um, So I knew we would probably be talking about your higher level class, the MA, and I wanted to go a different direction a little bit. So I spoke with Anne Rearick, who is this, she's been teaching full time for 32 years, 31 of them at an independent high school in Massachusetts called the Cambridge School of Weston, where she teaches alternative processes, beginning through advanced levels of analog and digital photography, portrait photography, documentary. She's also taught workshops in France and Chile, and she has a newish book out about the Basque Country, published by the Deadbeat Club, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes. That's just stunning. She has spent like 30 summers or visited 30 times this one area, sort of between France and Spain. And her work is just absolutely beautiful. She is interestingly self-taught and only picked at 26. And I'm so proud that she's on this Blue photo site that I started not that long ago. And she's Terrific. So I asked Anne, why study photography? Why avoid studying photography? And she said, I would recommend studying analog photography before all else. The entire process, from photographing to processing film and printing negatives, teaches students to slow down, be more intentional in their photography. Film is expensive, and methodical in the darkroom. There are no shortcuts, not for my students anyway. They learn to be more disciplined in their seeing because in the beginning classes, I don't allow them to crop. Learning photography teaches students to become more present in the world, begin to understand the beauty of light, to begin to see in new ways, and to notice what is often overlooked. Don't study photography if you expect to make a living from it.
Wow. Um, yeah, oh gosh, I so disagree with her on the analog. Let's just get that out there. I've said it before, and we'll just leave it at that. We just disagree. However,
Well, I do want to remind you that she's teaching teenagers.
yeah, and she's got, but there's a slight issue with that because I inherit teenagers who come into the degree process at university, and quite often they will have done analog previously. We are a completely digital kind of teaching environment. We have no analog. Primarily because what I find is that they've become too obsessed with process and not seeing. And in 2025, when they've got the phone in their pockets, I'd rather they learn to see using their phone, which they can do all of the time. I'm not quite so worried about the speed thing. However, what I also do say is none of our students are allowed to crop their images for 3 years.
Right. So
So I completely agree with her on that, on getting it
I,
right in camera.
I do think there's something to learning about the history of photography
Yeah.
by doing the analog processing. I do feel like, oh, this was not created by AI with a ton of filters on Instagram. This was done by dodging and burning and whatnot. And I think, whether or not you continue to do that on your own, you probably won't. It's important to know what went into the pictures that you see and that you respect from the past.
I don't know. I don't agree. I think I'm more interested, to be honest with you, in AI and becoming friends with AI
Yeah,
rather
okay.
than
You and I are going to have another go round on that because let's table that guy for the moment. Um,
Well, I'll just tell you that I'm currently looking at the ideas of AI in education. So I'm more interested in dealing with moving image and with AI and the creative functionalities we have now, which are about the future rather than the past. But that's perfectly okay. And I'm not anti-analog people. I really am not. However, I just don't get that for me, it's like saying I want to play the electric guitar, but before I'm allowed to, I've got to learn the mandolin. It just doesn't come together for me.
yeah, I mean, I like what I think this idea of slowing down is and seeing more carefully and more intentionally.
I
Um,
just don't get that.
Yeah,
I don't get that.
what can I
Yeah,
say? I do. I think, and especially with teenagers who are always constantly bumping into each other and running around and screaming, this idea of slowing down is important.
I agree. Yeah, but when I was an analog photographer, which I was for a long time, I don't work any quicker now with digital than I used to with analog. I work at the same speed. But also, my 14-year-old uses her phone every morning and she takes photographs on her walk to school. And it could be of a snail, it could be of the light of the tree, whatever.
Great.
And
All
then
great.
she WhatsApps them to me straight before she gets into school every morning. Now, she doesn't need slowing down,
Well,
but actually,
I mean, her father's a photography professor, so it's a bit of a skewed sample set.
all
But
right, all right. Let's move on. Have
all
you
right.
spoken to anybody else?
Well, I want to read one more answer from Anne, and then I
Yeah.
want to move on to I think someone who's going to wrap some of this up in a nice way. I
Brilliant.
asked Anne, are there aspects of photography that can't be taught? Are there limits to what can be learned? She says, I can't teach a student to show up, to do the work, to be disciplined in their practice. Hard to teach someone to develop a personal vision. This emerges over time with patience and dedication. All I can do as a teacher is nurture and emphasize specifically balance. Oh, sorry, emphasize specificity and balance within a frame. Um, so the last person I spoke with, and we've spoken with him before, is Alex Harris. And we've spoken with him before because I always find him wise and insightful and so articulate about this. Alex was a professor of documentary photography at Duke University for decades, co-founded the influential Double Take magazine, is a Guggenheim Fellow and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's published
I
some.
better not argue with him, had I?
No, not probably not. Although he's good about the good give and take.
Yeah.
He's published 18 photo books, and his work is held by the Met, the Getty, Museum of Modern Art in New York, and many, many others. I asked Alex the same question: if photography can be taught, and he responded with this. And this is why I love Alex. Perhaps a better question is, can photography be learned? In college, I took a course from Walker Evans. Evans told us the first day that if we were in the class because we thought he could teach us to be photographers, we were in the wrong room. He made it clear that if we were photographers, well, that's a gift that would emerge in its own time. He did make it clear, though, that becoming a photographer would not happen in the classroom or the gallery or the museum. It would come from our engagement with the world outside the university walls.
Well, I'm not going to argue with Alex, and I'm really not going to argue with Walker Evans because I couldn't agree more with that, which is exactly the premise I was sort of putting forward earlier, that actually it's a conversation. And it doesn't have to be and it shouldn't just be a conversation with your lecturer or the photographer or whoever is teaching you. It really should be a conversation through your camera with the people that you meet and the places that you go to.
Yeah, absolutely. I asked Alex what can be taught, and he said, I believe the process of editing your own pictures is an essential skill for a photographer and a process that can be taught. Our photographs of the world are not the same thing as the world itself. They are a parallel universe closely related to the world we live in, but our pictures create their own separate reality. That reality is created in editing. I do believe editing can be taught to students by getting them to learn to trust their own instincts.
How did you learn to edit pictures, Bill?
Hmm. Um, so I was a word editor and a story editor, and in some ways it's not so different. But I really, while I was at Life magazine, I spent a lot of time, not surprisingly, with the photo department, with our director of photography, the late great George Pitts. And I learned a lot from George about pacing and introducing a concept or holding something back until the end. And and he encouraged me to think about it as a short film.
Yeah, I've always seen it as a visual sentence
Yeah.
in a similar way, that connection. But I always say when people say to me about, how do you learn? Because I think that the more experience you get, the quicker you get at doing
Yes.
it. Because really editing is a process of rejection. You're
Yes.
rejecting the images that don't work. You're not choosing the images that you like.
Right.
And the way to do that is just keep looking at photography. The more photography you look at, the better judge you will become of photography. Just like the more you read, the better writer you'll become.
100%. And one of the things when people do approach me about, they say, "Oh, I've got this book and I have 500 images and I need to cut it down to 60." And I'm like, "Well, have you tried?" They're like, "Yeah, I can't do it." And I'm always like, "Try harder. Make 5 buckets. Yes, or like no for sure, no maybe, maybe, yes, yes for sure." And that's the way I think people can learn how to edit. by
Yeah.
taking.
Though they also need to know the why, because
They have to know the
if you
why.
don't know why, you won't know how to edit.
And you have to think about, to use your metaphor, what do you want somebody to feel when they get to the end of that sentence?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you really keep that in mind, the editing becomes a little easier, I've found.
It does. Anything more to add?
Yes.
Excellent.
Um, I asked, let's see, I asked Alex, assuming that someone is really interested in being a photographer, why study photography and why avoid studying photography? Um, and in his response, he echoes Ann Rearick a little bit. He says, in every class I've ever taught over the years, once students are assigned to focus on the world through a lens, they tell me they are paying attention, noticing nuances of life, of light, of emotion in some ways they've never done before. This is genuinely exciting for them. Whether or not you believe photography can be taught, paying attention with a camera is paying attention. And my sense is that that's a lifelong skill. It can't be unlearned. Um, I asked Alex also, what are a couple of the most important skills, practically or intellectually, that a student can learn from studying photography? And I love what he says. He says, photography is essentially about time. A student photographer begins to notice the way the world changes over tiny increments of time. They must be present and focused to determine not simply when to click the shutter, but more importantly, to respond to what it is about a particular moment that interests them. These are not conscious intellectual decisions. They happen with a flash of the mind and mostly by instinct. A student photographer must learn to trust their instincts. He goes on to say, photography is essentially about light. Students, like all of us, have the experience of seeing something especially beautiful or noteworthy, photographing it, and finding out the resulting photograph falls short of capturing what they saw or appreciated. Students must become like farmers, paying attention to the weather to know when to sow or harvest their crops, when the light will be right, and must know their equipment well enough to have it set up to capture a particular kind of light.
Well, that's a very beautiful place to end it, wouldn't you say?
I do think so, absolutely. The one thing that I think you mentioned before, which is subject matter, I
Yeah.
do think is important because I think when students are struggling to find subject matter, as you were talking about, I think today, my experience is a lot of them look within. A lot of them say, I'm this kind of a person. I have this kind of a background. Um, I should be paying attention to my ethnicity or my gender identity or my own lived experience. Um, what do you think about that?
I think, and I may be completely wrong about this, of course, but I feel that we're coming to the end of that. I'm noticing new students that are coming to me who are more interested in the world and the outside. And I think that certainly from a UK perspective, there's been a lot of education at schools around kind of well-being and mental health and all of that kind of stuff, which I think is starting to show fruit. And I think also I'm starting to see the end of the COVID quietness.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm hoping that that is coming to an end because I agree with you that we've had it for a long time. But I do think maybe it's changing, but very small seeds. And I think it's going to take a while for it to actually kind of push through into the bigger world. I mean, there's one of my students has made a body of work I'm just curating for the Photo Oxford Festival coming up this October. And it's called The Night Climbers of Oxford, where he went out at 2, 3 in the morning, photographing people who climb up the sides and over the roofs of all the famous Oxford buildings illegally with no ropes, no safety harnesses, nothing. And it's that kind of story that we used to see a lot of,
Yeah.
which I'm really keen to see more of.
Yeah.
And for a few years, we weren't.
Alex's background, when he was, I don't know, 22 years old, he's a white guy, a gringo from the South. He spent years, a decade or so, if I'm not mistaken, in northern New Mexico, near where I live now, living in a small town populated mostly by Hispanic and Native people. And he made incredible. He learned how to be a photographer there, really. And then he was also up in the Inuit communities in remote Alaska. And so when I asked Alex along these lines, what's a common misconception that people have about studying photography, he said one is that you aren't allowed to step outside of your own world or life experience as a photographer. That your work that for your work to ring true, to be authentic, that as a photographer, you must stick to your own gender, sexual identity, racial or economic background. He said, as a photographer, I'm inspired by the writer Reynolds Price, who wrote the novel Kate Vaden from the perspective of a woman. And Price wrote, "We love and hate, multiply and perish, alone, alone in virtually identical ways. Any attempt to deny that fact is an assault on the everywhere visible unity of human emotion, the need and demands of our bodies and minds." And to me, that's the thing about being human, irrespective of economic background, racial identity, et cetera, where you live, et cetera, is so much richer. We share these things about life and death and procreation and fear, that if that's the thing that you're interested in, you can find it anywhere. And therefore your subject matter is everywhere if you want it to be.
Exactly that. And I think that's the key, is that don't think that a photographer is somebody who takes photographs of things you've seen before just to hang on a wall. It's the studying of the medium will take you on a journey which is deep. And I think you do have to go way within yourself as a photographer to find your subject matter. But your subject matter isn't necessarily within you, but it's come from within you. It is those passions, those interests, that inquisitive nature, which kind of drives the photographer to use a camera to document what's important to them. And I think if we use the phrase subject matter, subject has to matter to you. It really doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. As long as it matters to you, then you should be making that work. By studying the medium, you not only find out about people who have made that work before you, but also you can find it within yourself, because there's going to be hopefully somebody pushing you into those difficult places which are required.
And to also think about, maybe you're being pushed to think about why it matters to you.
Yeah.
Like really in your psyche, in your emotional landscape, why do those things matter to you? And I think for me, that's really the key.
Do you know, I saw a student showed me a body of work recently, a portfolio, and it was okay. It was just full of photographs, really. But there was one photograph that really stood out, and it was of an elderly man. And I said to the person, I said, "Well, why have you shown me that picture? Because that's your strongest picture by a long way." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I've never shown that to anybody. That's my father just before he died." And I was like, that's it. That's photography. I could spot that. It stood out. It meant something to you. That's what's really important. And, and I could actually thank him for sharing that. So maybe that's where we should end this month's episode.
I think so.
Bill, great as always. Thank you so much to all of the people you spoke to for their contributions. Really valuable, as always. And I think a good subject. So thank you for suggesting it.
Yeah, of course. And we'll include all of these folks' Instagram handles and websites in the show notes so that people can go a little deeper and look at their work.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, do please get in touch with Bill and myself and let us know what you thought about what we've said. But also, why not share your experiences of photographic education, both good and bad? And let's keep that conversation going.
I'd be really interested to hear that. Good idea.
So you can get hold of Bill.
I'm at Bill Shapiro on Instagram.
And obviously, through the new looking United Nations of Photography.com website, I've just redesigned it to try and make it easier to navigate and read. You can contact me directly through there, which I know a lot of you do. And as you know, that I've been reading out listeners' letters in previous episodes as well, because they're always so good. Bill, thank you so much. I look forward to catching up with you again next month.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Grant.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this month's conversation and do get in touch. As I say, if you are interested in learning a little bit more about learning photography from me, then you can do that by going to the Oxford Brookes University website. Put in photography, you'll come across our undergraduate course and also our master's course. On the master's course, there's a button there you can press, which will set up an interview with me and we can talk photography. Anyway, in the meantime, of course, take care.